In today's recording, I'm going to be talking about my evidence for Teaching Standard 7 Behaviour Management. So the context of the starting point for my evidence is a lesson with a class that I felt like I was struggling with in terms of developing any sort of consistency, what I would describe as poor levels of rapport, because I couldn't get the pupils to do what I wanted them to do as part of the lesson, and just the fact that low-level disruption seemed to be getting in the way of the students' learning. This is reflected through both my mentor's written feedback in terms of the inconsistency of my behaviour management. So, for example, him noting that students weren't listening to the task and that it's irrelevant how good planned content is if poor behaviour means that it can't be delivered, because students that aren't listening and who aren't paying attention likely aren't learning either. So, as I said, low-level disruption, pupils who are slower to respond to what I was asking them to do, them becoming easily distracted, and this I felt like was snowballing into other problems in regards to what these students were actually learning. So my mentor was basically saying, how can I put steps in place to make sure that all students are listening and to question why these behavioural disruptions are occurring in the first place. And as you can see from my pupil tracker, that where these low-level disruptions were present, so particularly in the early phases of these lessons, again, I'm just going to try and maximise this so it makes it easier to see, but you can see that from a learning outcome perspective, a lot of pupils with bronze and a few with silver, but on the whole, no one reaching my gold objectives. And I feel like part of the reason for this was the fact that the behavioural disruptions were too frequent. You can also see that there is plenty of verbal warnings as marked by this VW in the first 3 lessons. And I also felt like pupils weren't really respecting my authority. So even though I was giving out a lot of verbal warnings, I should have been following through with negatives, which is the school's behavioural policy. I felt like I wasn't being listened to, and I felt like, to a certain extent, pupils were walking over me, as it were. So you can see not much in the way of attainment going on, pupils not reaching the gold objectives, and plenty of verbal warnings, which again just shows that I probably also wasn't setting expectations that high if I was warning pupils that frequently. This is also reflected in a recorded discussion with my mentor, who stated that low-level disruption and some advice as to what to do and re-establishing expectations if possible, because if the students don't know what the expectations are, then you can quickly see how low-level disruption almost becomes acceptable when obviously it certainly isn't. So from an action standpoint, as somebody from a more of a coaching background than teaching background prior to my PGC, I will sort to look through previous lecture content and the notes that I've made on this to see what things stood out for me and what examples resonated with me most in terms of what practices I wanted to adopt as a teacher moving forward. So the first thing that stuck out was use of a regular routine. So for example, whilst this might be common within classroom taught subjects, or it certainly was in lessons that I'd seen in my previous placement, I hadn't really thought about how I could use a routine to set the expectation whilst also simultaneously managing behaviour. So firstly, I needed to find out what worked. Secondly, I needed to set high expectations in regards to behaviour and make sure these were in line with the rest of the school, as well as making sure that these behavioural expectations were understood, applied, and there was consequences to pupils' actions when their low-level behaviour did disrupt the lessons. So I needed to put these appropriate routines in place and ensure that pupils were following them, whilst also trying not to use my voice as much, because what would happen is it just becomes to a point where my voice loses its currency and that pupils and myself are just shouting over the top of each other, which obviously isn't productive to learning within the lessons. So what I wanted to do was not only establish these routines, but get into habits of communicating that disruptive behaviour was unacceptable through my mannerisms. So, for example, tactical typical ignoring, waiting for silence, and also making sure that I wasn't inadvertently adding to these behavioural disruptions, either through my planning or by being confrontational, inadvertently confrontational with students and my questionings of them. So from these notes, I decided that my routine would be, as well as using timers to get changed, I would meet each student before they walked into the changing room. I would make sure that I had, where possible, something positive to say, whether it was in regards to pupils entering the changing room or simply during the lesson, and really focusing on building rapport with students. A few of the behaviour books that I read, as I said, coming from a coaching background and not knowing much about managing behaviour within the context of a PE lesson, and not really having that many behavioural issues to deal with during my coaching, because typically in a coaching setting, kids are there through choice rather than having to be there as a result of being in school. So here's some of my notes from the books that I read, with my personal take on how I could use these notes to tweak my practice in green and yellow. So the key things for me were that pupils have a choice in the behaviours they make, and the expectation should be that pupils can make positive choices in relation to their behaviour. Also, what's clear is that making these choices or behaviours, as it were, more explicit to pupils, and it's too easy to assume that pupils know what they should be doing. So indirectly praising students for adopting positive behavioural choices, and also making other pupils aware of that without necessarily stopping a whole group at a time. So also depersonalising punishment with students by being aware of the school's behavioural policy and making it more about the students' actions and the consequences in line with the behavioural policy, rather than these consequences being a result of trying to make it personal and about them disrupting my lesson, they're disrupting their own learning. And also using, so for example, William Perkin used the 10-10 ethic, part of which is accepting support and acknowledging weakness. So where possible, link it back to the 10-10 ethic when it comes to administering disciplinary action. So reinforce the rules within the context of the school, ensure there's appropriate differentiation so pupils aren't bored or frustrated, and making sure I can actually see pupils at all times, because as I said, the low-level disruption was probably also a result of the fact that I couldn't actually see all students at all times. So in terms of what this action led to from an implementation standpoint, again, I'll just maximize this so it's easier to see. But the key routines I was looking at was a timer to get changed. So there's the expectation that pupils are ready to learn and that they will be held accountable for this, both using the school's behavioural policy, which is positives for actions that are conducive to learning, and verbal warnings and negatives for actions that are not conducive to learning. So for example, by having pupils in pre-organised teams, set the expectation that time is important rather than getting out to the field and then trying to do teams on the field. Secondly, it allowed me to manage behaviour as I was more aware of which pupils can work well together and which pupils can't. So although there's certainly elements of other standards or some crossover between standards, there's still going to be a communication indirectly or otherwise that time is important and that we will make best use of it, and pupils disrupting the lesson and making poor use of time need to be reprimanded for that as well. So as I said, also positives or praise for pupils who've noticed stuff like team lists, because clearly these pupils are paying attention, and re-establishing my expectations and potentially communicating this in context of what those rules might look like in the classroom, just so pupils are really aware of what I expect of them and what is and isn't acceptable. And also planning for example, high ability pupils, making sure that, for example, they've got an extra challenge, or I'm communicating high expectations of them in order to indirectly manage their behavior as well. So what you can see on this lesson plan is clear routines, and this is something I adopted in future lessons moving forward. So pupils would always have the timer set. There would be positives and negatives, or positives and verbal warnings, should I say, awarded in light of pupils' readiness to learn, and pupils became very accustomed to what I expected of them very quickly. And what this enabled me to do, or what this resulted in, was better achievement for the students. So if I just scroll down to the PE tracker, so you can see here in the latter 2 weeks of teaching this class, you can see that although there's still some verbal warnings in there, there's certainly much less, and that I was beginning to use more positive praise and actually putting this on the school system. And what I felt like this did was indirectly communicate the behaviours that I was after, so pupils had a clear roadmap of what was expected. And if we look at the what was attained in the attainment in the first 3 weeks, again, a lot of bronzes, a lot of silvers, so that's represented by the red and the yellow. Whereas in the latter 2 weeks, where pupils have become familiar with these routines, it's by no means perfect, but the attainment grades are moving in the right direction, as are the behaviours as well. But you can also see as well that negatives have been put on where pupils haven't heeded instructions. So I feel like this is also communicating to the pupils that when I say something and I communicate that there will be a consequence, that they're beginning to understand that I am going to be consistent and I am going to follow through with this action. Also, what you can see is a lesson observation. So my mentor stating that I had really good behaviour management and that I was clear with my expectations, and I would reinforce these where they're not met. Also waiting for silence, so I'm not just trying to shout over pupils, indirectly communicating my expectations here. And you can see that my routine was noticed in terms of setting a time when students come in, and this allowing me to reinforce the school's behaviour policy, whilst also communicating the importance that pupils are there to learn, whether or not they turn up in kit. So that is my evidence for teaching standard 7 behaviour management, and the references of the books that I gained a lot of that information from down at the bottom here. So thank you for watching, and I'll stop the video there.